Our reading this morning from Matthew chapter 13 gives us 3 parables. The first one illustrates something quite simple, that a seed can grow into a shoot, which in turn grows into an enormous tree in which the birds of the air live and thrive. It sort of suggests a place of great plenty, a place of great blessing that's grown to something enormous. And Jesus uses this to illustrate the kingdom of heaven, and it's a good illustration. Those of us who've come to faith in Christ, just think about the change that has made in our lives. Initially, we start to see things differently, and then we start to think differently. And as we think differently, we start to act differently. And that in turn changes the direction of our lives. As we learn more about Jesus and take seriously the call to follow him, our priorities start to change. We do things we'd never have thought of doing years before. And those things make a difference not only to us, but also to others, to the people we encounter. So they start to ask, well, why? What's brought about this change? And they want to know about Christ too. And some of them come to faith, and their lives begin to change. The most vivid example of this I've ever encountered is a minister I've now known for some years who lives out in northeast India. He's quite elderly now, but when he was a young man in his teenage years, he had to leave his home in what is now Bangladesh and walk into West Bengal to create a new life for himself. Not knowing what to do, he joined the Indian Army, where he encountered a chaplain who told him about the Christian faith, and he came to faith himself. When he left the army, he stayed in that area and started walking around the villages, just sharing how he'd encountered Jesus Christ and the change that had made to his life. Some of those hearing, well, they came to faith too. And as they shared their faith, others came to faith. In one particular place, a whole village came to faith. That village was right by a river and prone to flooding. So the minister, on behalf of the people, went to the local authority and negotiated that the village be moved onto slightly higher land, which was granted. As a consequence, it became known as Issabusti, the Jesus village. In other villages too, people came to faith. They planted churches. Over the 50-odd years since, about 50 churches have been planted. And the people from those churches have identified need. They were concerned about orphan children and families struggling. So they formed orphanages. They became concerned about the educational needs of children, not just their own, but anybody in the community. They planted a school. Now, during this time of pandemic, they're taking food to others in the village, just as a way of sharing the blessing that they've encountered. In our society, we rarely see such a long-term change, maybe because we so often move around. Many of us live in a place for 4 or 5 years and then we go on to live somewhere else. So we don't see the whole process through, but that process goes on. In fact, in some ways, it's even more extensive because the passing on is shared more widely over a much greater geographic area. Our first parable simply states that the kingdom of heaven grows. It starts small, it grows into something that's really big, and it really does. The second parable emphasises the point that such a growing blessing really is a must-have thing. Think about that blessing for a moment. The difference that's achieved, lives given hope and purpose, people who thought they had nothing, suddenly realising they can have so much as they encounter the Christian gospel. You know, that, as we think about it, can be a real challenging thought. Challenging because we've got to ask, if we really want to be a part of this growing kingdom, that grows and spreads and blesses so many, what's holding us back? What's keeping us from it? And what we see in the second parable is simply that the man who encountered it recognised that nothing he'd valued up until that point was anything compared to this kingdom. So he's willing to give up anything in order to receive it.
God's righteousness revealed, the Son of Man, the Son of God, His kingdom comes. Jesus, redemption sacrifice. This kingdom's King has come, and this kingdom's reign, and this kingdom's rule, and this kingdom's power and authority. Jesus, God's righteousness revealed. Of God, the Word of God revealed to us. Jesus, God's holiness displayed, now glorified, now justified. Kingdom comes, and this kingdom will know no end, and its glory shall know no bounds, for the majesty and power of this kingdom's King has come. Righteousness revealed, and this kingdom will know no end, and its glory shall know no bounds, for the majesty and power of this kingdom's King has come. This kingdom's reign,
final parable indicates that there will one day be a judgment where only what's of value will be kept. And that's when the difference will be seen between those who've been willing to exchange everything for the kingdom of heaven and those who have not. When I came to faith in Christ at the age of 16, I would never have thought of becoming a Christian minister. But then I couldn't have imagined all of the things that I've seen since, all of the lives that have been transformed. The kingdom of heaven always starts small and always grows.